You're on the Success Secrets for Business, Family, and Life channel. I'm Vickie Helm. This is the Coffee Break Show. Today, I have with me Tom Fox. And today, we're going to talk about one of the things that I bet you like to ignore about your business. And one of the most important things that you should not ignore about your business. Today, we are going to be talking with compliance expert Tom Fox. Now, this guy has been everywhere in the compliance industry. So he's the founder of the Compliance Podcast Network, and he has over 15 years where he's been general counsel and chief compliance officer. He's now an independent consultant, and he assists companies with anti-corruption, anti-bribery compliance, and international transaction issues. And whether we want to talk about it or not, this is a topic that every business owner needs to know about. And Tom, I would like to just start with the why is compliance so important?
So compliance is so important for a couple of reasons. Number one, the world economy loses $3 trillion, that's three with a T, trillion dollars annually to the international scourge of bribery and corruption. If you add in money laundering, there's another 2 trillion. So that's 5 trillion lost to the world economy. So on a world basis, a worldwide basis, and those numbers come to us from the United Nations, it is a huge problem. But say you have a company, you're here in the United States, you don't sell overseas, you don't have to worry about international transactions. You're a privately owned company, not a U.S. public company. The question is, why should you, worry about compliance? The reason is simple. If you don't have a compliance program in place that is auditable, meaning someone can look at it and review it, you're probably not going to be able to do business with other companies because they're going to want to see your compliance program no matter what industry or market you are in. Your customers may want to see it. Your investors may want to see it. Banks who loan you money will want to see it. And insurance companies who insure your risks want to see it. So really, to do business on any sort of large domestic level, and by large, I mean literally over $1 million, you're going to need a compliance program in place. You're a startup, you have big dreams, you need a compliance program to access cash to expand your business.
This is so important what you just said. And I want to give people a reality check when you talk about $5 trillion, because right now it's looking like, we're $31 trillion in debt as a nation, and trillions is becoming the new billions word. But the truth is, if you spent $750,000 a day for 2,000 years, like you could go all the way back to when Jesus was born and spent $750,000 a day, you'd be about halfway through $1 trillion. That's how much money he's talking about. Now, imagine where that industry is. And we're talking about also it being fleeced by corruption and things like that. Now, the benefits of having a compliance thing in place, you talked about, Tom, was doing the ability to do business, the ability to get funding, and the ability to have people, your clients and customers, trust you. And I want to talk more about that aspect of it, the clients and your clients and customers trusting you with a compliance thing in. And I was wondering if you could tell us maybe 3 reasons that's important, or how or where a company should focus that towards the future.
So first of all, that was as good an articulation of the amount of money the world loses to bribery and corruption as I've ever heard. So I just will let you know right now, I'm going to purloin that from you. But your point and your question is even more prescient because it's trust.
Yes.
Business runs on trust. I'm a lawyer. I do contracts. I understand all of that. But the reality is, if I don't trust you, I'm not going to do business with you. If I don't trust you as a consumer, I'm not going to use your product. And what social media has done, it hasn't changed the debate. It's amplified it. So if you do something wrong or you're accused of something and it goes viral on social media, it will cost you far more than any legal or regulatory fine and penalty a government or a regulator may assess because you'll lose sales. And if you
That's
lose
right.
sales, that's a number off the top line, not the bottom line. A fine or penalty may be, oh, that's just the cost of doing business. Oh, we've reserved that. Don't worry. We've got that covered in our financial statements. But if you lose sales, you're never going to get those sales back. And so in today, 2023, because of the prevalence of social media, you have to be even more concerned about your compliance program, because if heaven forbid something does come up, you want to be able to turn the narrative and tell your story. Not only did we not do that, here's our compliance program, which shows we didn't do it.
Mhm.
And we're going to be transparent about it. But it all relates to the word you said, trust. And I cannot think of a better word to describe compliance than trust.
And to me, that's the whole focal point of what's happening right now. The Edelman Trust Barometer for this year in 2023 is the lowest it's ever been in history. And what it does is measure the consumer trust, and it's the lowest it's been in history. And I agree with you about the social media thing. And this is the thing that I want to talk about. It doesn't matter whether the complaint is real or not. It is going to be that even if there's a deep fake out there of you with AI or something that is saying that you have done something that you didn't do, you will suffer the consequence of lost sales and lost revenue. They don't even have to prove its accuracy. I mean, maybe later. I mean, we're doing the Dominion voting thing right now, but Dominion took a hit from its voting systems. That business took a big hit. Those businesses take a hit. Now for a court to decide whether it's real or not. They settled out of court, but that's not the point. The point is that lost business, that lost trust, that is something that you may not be genuinely able to get back. So, how does compliance help you create trust? What are 3 ways that it helps your business create trust? And if you're startup right now, Tom, if you're starting up, let's say your venture is starting up right now, how important is it to have your compliance piece in place?
So, number one, compliance is really about corporate culture, the culture of your business. And that starts literally at the top, whether it's the founder, whether it's the CEO, or whether it's the board of directors. So number one, it's all about culture. And even the legal regulators now tell us, we're going to look at your culture. We're not going to look at your internal controls. We're not going to look at your policies and procedures. I mean, they will look, but it's really about culture. Number two, and I have to reiterate something I started with, you can't access capital unless you have a compliance program in place that is auditable, that someone can look at. And number three, it's the ultimate insurance policy. And you gave the exact reason. Say a deep fake of Tom Fox comes out. Well, I have a reservoir of trust because people know me. So I get to dip into that, but I'm going to have to then step forward and prove I didn't do it. And I do that through an auditable compliance program. So it's both preventative, it detects violations, but the most important part is the reputation at the end of the day.
And I don't think we look at how delicate reputation is. This is the key point right now. And I feel as though there's going to be a future where reputation is going to be the most priceless asset that you have as the world continues to be disrupted by some of the technologies that we have right now. And reputation in compliance, if you already have that reputation built, the thing about compliance is you can have years of it, years of it, years of it. And that in itself becomes evidentiary, in my opinion, so that you can see, well, I've had it for this long. This is the culture. I want you to say more about how compliance is the culture. And I know that it can be in there. I'm thinking financial cultures right now, or, financial things when I look at culture and the statement you made. But I want to know, what do you mean? Say a little bit more about what you mean by it being a culture.
Sure. The message is simple. We're going to do business ethically and in compliance with legal requirements, in compliance with our own values as set forth in our code of conduct and policies and procedures, so
Yeah.
that we have a culture that's not simply in compliance, but we have a culture people are willing to speak up. If they see something, they say something. They are not going to worry
Yes.
about retaliation. They are going to be protected. Their
Yes.
report will be honored and investigated. And if there is something wrong, that the company will step in and quickly and efficiently remediate it. So it's not simply, I mean, it starts with doing business ethically and the right way. And if I could take your
Mhm.
point a step further, I talk to a lot of HR and human capital professionals who say that by 2030, the key corporate differentiator will be talent acquisition and talent retention.
That's correct.
And my daughter is 25, and it matters to her the reputation of the company she works at. So I'm a lawyer. Perhaps I'm more cynical, but I'm certainly not 25. And I have a different view on things, perhaps. But
Yeah.
there's a generation coming up, and
Yeah.
it's an entire generation, and we have to honor their wishes. And if you want to acquire the top talent and retain that top talent, trust and corporate culture is going to be absolutely critical.
Yes. Let's talk about corporate culture and compliance right now. What are the three most missed compliant things? Like, you're going to go in a business. Where's the three key areas that people should have compliance, but they actually don't, or they're ignoring it, or they don't think it's important? What are the three areas most people just drop the ball on?
Number one, and this is applies to startups or newer companies, it is robust financial controls. Um,
Ooh.
if you're a U.S. public company, you have to follow Sarbanes-Oxley.
Mhm.
SOX 404 is the financial controls compliance requirement. And most startups are private, so they don't have a legal requirement. But if you want access to capital, you're going to have to show robust
Yeah.
financial controls. And everyone has heard of FTX. Well, they
Yes.
grew spectacularly and they did not have sufficient financial controls. Now, they had a lot of other problems, but if you don't have sufficient financial controls, you're not going to be able to attract and retain top talent and top investors. So, number one is financial controls. Number two is that you have a compliance program written by lawyers for lawyers. And that's a huge mistake.
Ooh.
So I'm a lawyer. I understand that, but you have to talk to people in the language of business. And
Yeah.
so if I, as a lawyer, write a policy that's written in legalese, even the person who's trying to do the right thing and reads that policy is probably not going to understand it. And so that
I'm
makes the
not going to
policy
argue with that. That's so true.
no good. Exactly. So, right for your audience, and here I want to use one of my favorite tech phrases. It's all about the UX. It's about the user experience. Well, guess what? Who are the users in compliance? They're your employees. So it's
Yeah.
all about the UX. Have your compliance program designed for your employees going forward. And then is don't rest on your laurels. Monitor so that you can continuously improve your compliance program. You don't have to
Yes.
monitor everything and you don't have to do it all the time. But whatever your top two or three risks are, whatever that might be, if it's environmental, if it's food safety, if it's a product, if it's a service, if it's financial, is it you're doing business in China, whatever that risk is, monitor that risk so that you can improve your compliance program when you get more data or more information in about it.
I love what you're saying, Tom, because I know for myself, there's always that Stephen Covey thing, start with the end in mind. So what you have a tendency to imagine is how big and how great your company gets. But I know personally that as it gets big and as it gets greater, so does the need for compliance get big and greater. And I think that that portion where you were like, you have to figure out what you need consistently because the regulations change in your industry and you have to relook and work at, and compliance is a division of your company. It's a division of your success plan. If you don't have it, and I know this by personal experience, you can get spanked pretty hard, in that way. You can have some issues. And when you adopt and add compliance in there, it gives a level of surety and confidence, especially as an owner, that end in that mind, that end that you hold in mind has to have these legalese, these compliances in place as you start, before you start, while you're growing, as you're scaling each next step. And what we have a tendency to want to do, and this is where I'm guilty of it, is we want to ignore that piece. Or maybe we just want to hand it to an attorney and go, here, you fix it, you do it. But he just said three things that are really important. And the second one, the attorney that writes it in legalese so that nobody in your culture even understands what it says. That's so important. And I love the fact that we're bringing this to the forefront, because I think there's going to be a lot of changes in compliance rules as we move forward with technologies like AI that is right now, or digital currencies and payments online. So let's say right now we're a medium-sized business. We're doing about 20 million a year. And we're looking at the fact that we maybe are thinking in a little bit, we're going to go public. And in between the compliance that they currently have and the going public, right when they're going public, what are some of the key things you think that they should concentrate on? Let's say they're going from 20 million to 50 million, and maybe they'll go public after that. What is it that these companies that are medium-sized companies can do to make themselves compliant in such a way that they show consistency in growing the compliance as they grow their company? Because when you start offering to the public, you have to meet a whole different set of compliance, right? So is there some rules back here that people can implement so that when they get here, it's easier? It's kind of like if you put your business for sale, if you follow these rules, your business will sell faster than if you just try to do it when you want to go live. And it's not just about funding. This is now about meeting SEC rules and things like that when you go public. Do you understand my question?
Absolutely.
Great.
Number one, it is to have sufficient financial accounting controls. I know I mentioned that before, but I can't overemphasize it, because the day you go public, you have a SOX 404 obligation, and you as a CEO have to certify your financial records. And if you certify financial records that are false, that's called a criminal event. Yeah. So there's a lot of pressure around that. So number one is your financial controls. Now, although that may seem like the most difficult, it's actually the easiest because they're written down. Everyone knows what GAAP financial statement or GAAP accounting is and appropriate financial controls. That's number one. Number two is, and we touched on this, for you to determine the top 2 or 3 risks you face, whatever they are. Every company's different. Energy, food, transportation, it doesn't matter. But the key is to assess your risk, figure out what they are, and then put a risk management strategy in place, monitor that, and improve almost as a continuous improvement cycle. So it's one straight line: risk assessment, risk management strategy, strategy monitoring, strategy improvement. And then number 3 is, and where companies have the greatest risk of losing money, is around their sales. Now, you can have direct-to-consumer sales. You can have internal company sales agents, Or you can have third parties who are commission sales agents. If you're a
Mm.
product manufacturing company, perhaps distributors. But you
Yeah.
need to look at your sales, because that's where you could bleed money out, and someone could either defraud you, you could engage in corruption, creating a pot of money to pay a bribe to get a contract, or some
Wow.
other manner lose money. So it is financial controls, number one. Number two, risk assessment and management. And number three, look at your sales strategy and see if there's any problems or issues around that.
Wow. Wow. That was nuggets of gold. I mean, I'm glad this is recorded. That's all I got to say. I want to ask you, what should a CEO or business owner look for in someone who is going to do their risk assessment for them or help them with their compliance? What should they look for in a professional? It's not just that you're a lawyer. Is what are some of the things that you say? And if you want to work with him, don't worry. It's gonna be in the notes. It'll be scrolling across the screen. If you're worried about your compliance right now, and you should be, we'll get to that. But what do we look for in someone who is a compliance expert who can help the business owner or the CEO of that company become compliant or look at what the risks are?
So, with everyone you do business with, and I literally mean everyone your company does business with, you need to look at three things. Number one, why are you doing business with them? What's the business reason? If the business reason is to perform risk assessment, that's fine. But make sure you can articulate a business reason, because if it's my brother-in-law, that's not a business reason. The business reason may be my brother-in-law is the best risk assessment personnel in the United States, and that may be fair. But if it's because he's my brother-in-law, that's not a business reason.
I
Number
see.
two, look at the written documentation, i.e., their resume or whatever written information they provide, and perform background due diligence on that. In other words, ask some questions, do some investigation, find out, call their references, sort of all of those things. And then sit down across the table. And I don't want to say everything I've not said is be important, but use your eyes, use your ears, trust your gut. If the hair on the back of your neck stands up because something doesn't make sense, then listen to that. So use common sense, use the human element, but do the investigation, ask some questions, look at what they say, and have a real valid business reason that you can articulate for hiring that person.
Yeah, that to me is so important what you just said, because um, compliance, the thing about compliance is, this is just me talking from my own business experience. As long as my company is running and doing well, etc., my focus isn't on, am I meeting my compliance needs? Although I see now that it is actually part of branding, is, do you meet that, what your culture is with that? We don't see how important it is that it's there. And what I really want to get across to every entrepreneur who's listening there, because I have a big audience of that, this is so important to be talking about right now. I can't even tell you how important it is for the future. It's not just now, but the confusion that we saw with social media, the confusion and the lostness and the cancel culture and everything else that we have in this pile of confusion. One of the things that you have is reputation, and reputation is based on that culture. And that culture is really comes down to, are you compliant? I don't know, Tom, if you knew, oh God, I'm having a brain fart right now. Bill Bartman was a billionaire and he passed away a few years ago. But he had a business partner. He had the largest debt collection company in the world. And he's actually in the museums now as one of the top 15 entrepreneurs in history. Um, but at one point, his literal company was attacked by the government for his business partner did something shady, and he did everything in that compliance area. And so there are some businesses like debt collecting has a lot of compliance that is regulatory, that is just out there. And he literally went to court and won based on his compliance. And I'm giving you the quickie dry version of it. But what they did to him during this time, thinking that he was a bad guy and that he had done something corrupt like his business partner did. And that simple compliance thing that he had saved him in that time of need. And I have a feeling that as we move forward, what are some of the dangers, or I don't want to say dangers, but dangers that being and having compliance can protect you from moving forward? Do you understand my question?
Certainly. So, if we can look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an
Yeah.
example, there were significant changes in export control laws. That's another type of compliance.
Interesting.
Well, the companies that stayed in Russia suffered in the area of social media. They weren't penalized by the government, but US citizens said, well, if you're going to stay in Russia, we're going to quit buying your products.
Yeah.
And so having that kind of reputational damage literally immediately, simply because Russia invaded Ukraine, it is probably the most paramount example we have right now of that.
Absolutely.
So it's as much as I would like to say it's the law and the regulators tell us to do it. The reality is in today's social media world, with such transparency, companies have to be able to be nimble, be agile with their compliance programs. And in the case of the Russian invasion, they had to pivot immediately to divest themselves of businesses in Russia.
Wow, that was an incredible example of that, as we don't think about that as we move forward in business. It's some things are just happening in the world, and that can really attest to whether you're compliant with what your culture is or whatever is. It can turn on a dime, that supply chain issues and those. That's just something that's really something that's compliance that's almost out of your control, really, that has to happen.
Exactly. One of the most prescient thoughts I heard coming out of the pandemic that really applies to everything now was, we used to call it disaster recovery. Then we called it business resilience. Well, now it's just business as usual. And so if we have another pandemic type event, if we have another geopolitical change, what happens, something happens with China,
Yeah.
all of those things. And you as a company may have to literally pivot, not on a moment's notice,
Yeah.
but perhaps. And how are you going to do that in compliance? That's where compliance looks at your risks. We say you have a supply chain partially in China. Well, you have a risk there. How are you going to manage that risk if you can't get your raw materials or even finished goods out of China to sell or remanufacture in the United States?
And isn't that what a lot of people are looking at even right now today, even the auto industry, even the chip making thing? These are the things that keep us on our toes looking for answers. But it's interesting that you said pivot, where compliance actually helps you look at where you can pivot, why you should pivot, or when you should pivot. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to say a little bit more about that, because I think that when you start a business, sometimes I know for myself, I can put blinders on like this and think, this is the business I've started. This is what I'm going to do. And when you get to the point where you need to pivot, sometimes you don't pivot till it's crisis, instead of looking at the future and seeing the future of where you're going to need to be compliant.
Let me see if I can translate your question into compliance speak.
Thank you.
That's called a risk assessment.
Cool.
And you've assessed your risk. And part of your risk management strategy is to manage that risk. Excuse me. But part of that risk management strategy is, if that part of my supply chain is no longer available to me, where am I going to get my raw materials?
That's
and
right.
so by performing a risk assessment, analyzing that risk, and then managing it, you're going to be able to pivot quickly and efficiently.
That right there to me is whatever he charges per hour, he just gave you for free. That one thing right there, because it's so important as we're looking towards the future as to what's happening. This right there, that disruption or something is happening so much quicker. And whether it's climate change, whether it's politics, whether it's outright global war or resource management failing us or whatever, that has to be something that is top of mind as in any industry, but I was thinking especially for manufacturing. I mean, that would be the top. Let's talk about what you do for a company when you go into their company in the first place. They call you up and they're like, hey, we need to become and have compliance done. What do you do for your clients?
So really, the first question I say is, if your top salesperson, if you have a country manager, if your sales manager misses his numbers for 2 months, is he fired? Or if he does business ethically and under your company structures, do you keep him? Well, if the answer is he misses his numbers, I'm going to have to let him go and bring in somebody who hits their numbers. Yeah. Well, that tells me the most important thing is hitting your numbers. And if the CEO makes clear the most important thing is hitting the numbers, guess what? Everyone will hit their numbers. So it really starts with kind of assessing that corporate culture literally at the top of the organization. But then from there, it's having a conversation about how they do business, where they do business, and who they do business with, to understand the business and begin to formulate, how am I going to assess the risks your organization has? And although every formulation of a best practices compliance program says it starts with tone at the top, meaning leadership, it's really about the risk assessment. Because that's seeing how you're doing business, where you're doing business, and who you're doing business with, and what risks you might have in that, and then moving forward to manage them. And when you start to explain compliance really as a business process, every business person gets that. Yep. If I have on my lawyer hat and spout off laws and spout out SEC and DOJ and Reg B and SOX 404, you may or may not put them asleep. But if I start talking about, look, this is a business process, and this business process, and here's the key: effective compliance makes business processes more efficient. And if your business processes are more efficient, you're going to be a more profitable organization.
Absolutely. More successful.
And when I finally realized that, that's when my message really started resonating. So understanding and explaining that good compliance is just a business process, and we're going to integrate it into the user experience.
Thank you. I like that you do that. Integrate it with the user experience. Okay. Whether I'm a solopreneur, I have 5 people or 500 people or 500,000 people in my company. What are 3 key areas where you have to put compliance in the forefront before you can scale or grow to the next level? Like, what are 3 key times? And I would say at startup, definitely. But what are 3 key times where you're like, before you do anything, you get your compliance reviewed or put it in place?
So in terms of small private companies starting, certainly startup would be a great one, but that usually really doesn't happen.
That's true.
Where I've seen it most in that phase of a company is usually around round B, sometimes round C of funding.
Yeah.
Round A is your just true angel investors.
Happy somebody said yes.
Exactly. And when you get to B, then you're starting to get up $1 million, $5 million,
Yeah.
and sometimes as high as 10 million. And
Mhm.
then C, you're usually over 10 million. Well, at C, you're getting some pretty sophisticated investors who are
Yeah.
going to want to know not simply is my money safe, but are you
Yeah.
going to do business that's not going to cost me? So that's one area. Certainly, if you go public, because the legal requirements are
Yeah.
there. Then the other key change is if you go from a domestic sales base to any type of international sales. I don't mean material international sales. I don't mean all your business goes internationally, but the minute you go overseas, you fall into the jurisdiction of a law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that law prevents bribery and corruption by U.S. companies overseas. It does not apply inside the U.S. So you're under a very strict law that's robustly enforced by the Department of Justice and SEC, both civil and criminal penalties. So if you go overseas, you've got to have a compliance program to comply with that law.
So that brings this up to mind as I'm talking to you, Tom, because I look at every online business. I don't care if it's an information business, a Shopify store, whatever. You're suddenly an international business the second you put yourself online. Especially if you have an email list like I do, where it's people all over the world. And if they're buying from you, is that suddenly the kind of thing that you're looking at where it's not you're $100 million international company who's selling just a widget, but even the solopreneur who's making, I don't know, 2-3 million a year, but doing the sales all over the world. Aren't you international then as well?
So the law I referenced applies to foreign government officials and instrumentality. So state-owned energy companies, electric companies, or telecom companies. So if you sell into those areas, absolutely, you have to have some sort of compliance program in place. If you travel overseas to sell your product or services, the minute you go through customs, that law applies.
I see.
Even if you're back here in the United States doing a virtual training. So if you physically go overseas, if you physically ship something, a book, a widget, a thing, export control applies. Now, if you consult with people or I consult with people outside the United States, I'm not traveling overseas. And although I'm delivering something,
It's not tangible.
Right.
It has to be tangible. That's really interesting. I unlike most everyone else, I'm really fascinated with what we're talking about because I see it. My perspective is switching. It's interesting to see how effectual compliance is around the world in your business, in being a branded, trustful company, as the government wants you to comply as well so that it knows you're not corrupt or, things that are happening. But let's say you're a co-owner, co-founders. And I want to go back to the example of Bill Bartman. Let's say you're very compliant, but you find that your business partner has done some not quite so compliant things. And you don't want to lose your company. You don't want to lose what's happening. And let's say you've confronted your business partner. And the way I would say confront it is I would bring a compliance attorney in with me to sit down and say, did you do XYZ? And how that is going to, if you get to the point where there's a conflict in that way, what procedure would you have outside of mine saying, bring him in to talk with us at that time? What's the procedures for protecting you and your company if you have a business partner that did something shady?
So the government tells us, and the key in the government's mind for assessing a penalty, and once again, this is a penalty, this is not reputational damage, is what did you do when you found out? or in compliance speak, what was your remediation? So if you do find that someone in your company has engaged in illegal or nefarious activity, whether it's a co-founder, whether it's a salesman, or anyone in between, the key is going to be, how did you detect it? How quickly did you investigate it? And what did you do about it, or remediation? In terms of confronting, that's the last step, because what you do is you thoroughly investigate your books and records. Because if you can't make a case based upon your books and records, there is no case. And when you interview someone who you think may be a fraudster or is engaged in some other activity, you don't want to give them the chance to get out of it. You either have solid evidence or you don't. And if you have solid evidence, you just say, can you help me understand this? And either they can or they can't. But a critical element of the process you described, Vickie, is the internal investigation. And you have to have competent forensic accountants, fraud risk examiners, someone who knows books and records and could say, this doesn't look right, this doesn't smell right, this is wrong. And so you perform a thorough investigation, and that's how you make a determination. In terms of what the government wants, they want to see what you did about it. And if you have paid money to, in the form of a discretionary bonus or something else, to the person who engaged in the illegal activity, the government wants to see you try to claw that back, meaning recoup whatever they stole or you lost from them. So those are really the steps.
Wow. This is so helpful. You have no idea. And I was thinking, where was he 20 years ago when, we're all on that startup? Where was he? I think compliance is an interesting topic that is embraceable in a way right now that it's for me top of mind as we start going into the uncertainty of the future and what's going to happen, because I feel like there are some other things that compliance can dig up that is in that risk assessment. That is all kinds of things that I would think about right now. So, for example, I'm looking at climate incidences in the South in the United States. 100 tornadoes that touched down and ripped up everything, and there may be the only way that you can prove some things, which are sales or whatever else, is if you're already compliant. Do you have your accounting rules in place? Do you have everything in place? And to me, I want to ask you, I know that they tell you in your business to have your KPIs and SOPs in a physical format so that you can look at them. And now I'm assuming that these kinds of, any kind of company that has compliance things also has it in digital form online, so that if something happens to its physical building or its physical structure, it has a digital structure of compliance as well. Yes?
Yes. So for 40 years, I lived in Houston, subject to hurricanes at the whim of Mother Nature. So we all had our data backup in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Canada, in some place remote. But if I could, let me give a couple of examples of the insights compliance can provide around business processes.
Would love it.
So the first one was the major software company that we all use that has Windows.
Build company.
They wanted to look at their gift entertainment spend in a high-risk jurisdiction. And because it was high risk, they had a relatively low amount that employees could spend on a customer without pre-approval, something like $75. So a lunch, a dinner, or something.
Yeah.
And what they found was two things or three things. Number one, that the spending, every salesman had to spend something to get the clients or the customer's attention. So there was a minimum you had to spend.
Yep.
But then when you moved up to the highest range of spending on a customer, there was some point beyond which the customer never signed a contract. So basically you had to spend A, but once you got to Z, they didn't sign contracts. And whether that was because the customer liked to be entertained, they liked to be wine and dine, they wanted to be seen with these people, whatever the reason. Well, the insight that the company drew was, okay, every salesperson has to spend A, but when they get to Z, no more on that customer, and you move to the next customer. And they all thought the sales team would revolt. Well, it turned out the sales team loved it because they now had a measurable metric by which they knew, hey, this guy's not going to sign a contract with us.
Yeah.
So they moved to the next customer. So it actually decreased their sales cycle because they knew when to stop. Totally unexpected. The second was,
that was cool.
Yeah, a major air conditioning manufacturer. And I don't mean a window unit for your house or my house. I mean, systems for a building or a physical plant, just huge systems. Yeah. So outside the United States, their customers were foreign governments. And they used to routinely bring foreign government officials to their manufacturing facility in the United States at no charge to see the manufacturing process. Well, they decided that was too high a risk. So they decreed no more free trips. Now you could still come, but the foreign official had to pay their own way. And once again, they thought the sales team would go crazy. Well, what happened was, because under the prior regime, it was at no cost, this was viewed as a huge plum by foreign government officials. So they would come over, and it was people who had no intention of buying the equipment, or they didn't have decision-making authority. And so the first thing that happened was they reduced their expense, and it was a 7-figure expense. So it was not insignificant.
Wow.
So they reduced that expense immediately, but then they found the quality of their customer went up exponentially, because if someone came from Central Asia to their manufacturing plant, they were invested in the system and they were probably going to sign a contract. So they actually decreased their sales cycle and increased the number of sales they made by doing away with the free trip. So those started off as compliance investigations or changes, and they ended up improving the sales cycle. So that's part of the reason I say properly seeing compliance is a business process.
That's right. It is a business process, and one that is interesting because it's like auditing in a way that can save you money. It can increase the quality of your client. It can go ahead and make your sales team and culture happier because they have some bar set where it's more realistic to them to go into it. I love the way you put that, because I would have never guessed that compliance was, because you always think regulatory. Am I meeting the laws? But this is where compliance is actually business strategy. This is where it meets that, acumen of having the parts of your business tweaked so that profitability is in that place. I love that you shared that with us. So, Tom, I know there's some people right now. I don't know if you're on iHeartRadio or Pandora, where you are. I know you're listening and you're thinking, I got to talk to this guy. I absolutely got to talk to this guy. And I'm thinking, you're right. You do. You got to go talk to this guy. Where can they talk to you? Where can they get a hold of you? And, is there a site, or what can they do? And trust me, if you're driving, relax. It's going to be in the show notes. Drive safe. Go ahead.
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, Thomas R. Fox on LinkedIn. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I have a fabulous podcast network on this topic.
That's right. You do.
The Compliance Podcast Network at compliancepodcastnetwork.net.
Wow. Tom, it has been I just, I like to geek out on new topics, but today I have geeked out in a way. I am so charged by your conversation and understanding compliance in a way that I never have before. I mean, I understand and get it in a way I haven't before. It's not something that's arduous that I have to go do. It's for the betterment of my company, the betterment of its profitability, the betterment of its culture, its branding, and how it builds trust out in the universe. And to me, that's huge. That's a huge thing just by doing compliance. I want to tell you, I pride myself on bringing the best guest experts from around the world. Today, Tom has definitely delivered. I want to thank you for being on the Coffee Break Show today. I really enjoyed having you with us.
Well, Vickie, thank you. I enjoyed it myself.
All right, you guys, we'll see you next week when we have another great guest. And get a hold of Tom right now if you're looking at compliance. Just go to his site, which is going to be compliancepodcastnetwork.net, compliancepodcastnetwork.net, and give a listen to a show. Get better at compliance and choose to have more success in your life. This has been the Coffee Break Show. I'll see you guys next week.